Again, a very warm welcome to everybody. Well, technology does those things, but I think that it's also because it's Saturday. It's like a wake-up call. We're here, and we want to share so many beautiful things that we have, especially when we are early childhood educators, and we're always so eager to actually find new ideas and to do wonderful things in our classroom to help our children become the best. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Audrey Henry. So I'm going to go ahead so that we can begin to share who we are. And just as you saw, I'm Dr. Wilma Robles-Melendez. I'm a professor of early childhood education and leadership at Nova Southeastern University, where I have been teaching for many years. And I have to say that I'm very proud to say that I have been actually working and teaching many of our professional teachers that we have here in Miami-Dade, in Broward, and actually throughout the state of Florida. And I'm very happy today to be sharing this opportunity with my colleague, Dr. Audrey Henry. Dr. Henry, could you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Audrey Henry. I'm retired from Nova, where I've worked for almost 30 years. But retirement doesn't mean that I have left teaching, and I'm still working and still doing research and still learning new ideas and new ways to help teachers.
Wonderful. And I see that some of our participants are already also signing in and I'm beginning to share about themselves too. This is great. So what we have actually, we had already a very good introduction with our keynote speaker. And we were actually both saying there are so many wonderful ideas that we hope that we'll be able to expand during the opportunity that we have this morning. So let's begin first of all by finding out what are going to be some of the learning outcomes that we have for our session.
And Dr. Melendez, I think we should say that during this presentation, if they have comments or ideas, just post it in the chat.
Absolutely.
Or questions.
Yes, absolutely. We do welcome your questions and as well as your comment. And there will be some questions that we also have for you to share too. So we definitely look forward to all of those wonderful experiences too that you have in your classroom. And as learning outcomes for this morning, one of the first outcomes is that we want to actually explore more and define what do we mean and what is the need for higher order thinking skills when we're working especially with literacy development. And our next outcome is actually to identify some strategies that can help us to support the development of higher order thinking skills. And of course, we're going to discuss the role that questions have when we're building story comprehension. So those three outcomes are actually also very much implicit in everything that we do when we're building language and literacy development in our classroom. It is as well an opportunity to invite children to share and to connect with those stories, with those experiences that we bring into our classroom. And probably with the first thing that we want to say is that there's so many wonderful stories. There are so many wonderful children's books that can be actually shared, and that we know that you're already sharing in your classroom. Sometimes it becomes very hard to actually decide which one in particular we want to choose. And especially when we try to find those ones that we know children will enjoy the most and that will actually connect with children. And of course, one of the key questions is finding out which ones are going to be the best one to challenge children's thinking abilities. Something that we know is always so important because children bring so many wonderful ways to see and to react to reality. So it is actually as well, how do we know? How will we will be able to know how children are actually learning about the stories or the characters or the different events that happen in the story. And that's where we always try to find out what kind of questions and what is the role that questions have in building what we call story comprehension. And Dr. Henry, you want to go on and talk a little bit just as a background in terms of what is and why we need and take some
Yes,
time about literacy.
okay, and when we talk about and we go back to what the keynote speaker said about the importance of early literacy development, it's needed for individual success. If kids don't start out early with all the things they parents can do in the home, have conversations with their kids, not be afraid to use words that some might say are too difficult, because I've found that kids learn bigger words than they learn simple words like was or that, because bigger words have content, like the word elephant. If they see it once, they recognize it because it's big, it's a long word. So we shouldn't be afraid to have conversations with kids and to use language. Don't use baby talk, because that doesn't help them. And literacy development is key to school success. If they don't start out right, they're going to get to third grade and have a problem, and they're going to be struggling. So we have to make sure that we provide them with the necessary skills they need. We have to engage them in thinking, not just basic questions, but propose questions that gets them to think at a higher level. Even little kids, young kids, 4 years old, they have ideas, and sometimes they surprise us with the things they say or their responses to us. And all this promotes learning, engaging them, having conversations with them. And these empower children to learn and become better students, better readers, because if they don't have all these early learning skills, they're going to have more difficulty in the earlier grade levels.
And actually, we know and we certainly support what you're doing, because we know how much you do every day precisely to promote children's successful development. That empowerment that happens every day in your classroom is what is going to make children become the very best in the future.
And as the keynote speaker said, there's some things we have no control over. For example, like what happens at home, but we have to do our part when the kids come to us.
That's for sure. And again, this is where we find that it's so important for us to, whenever we're sharing a story, whenever we're bringing some of those wonderful children's books into the classroom, to also make that into an opportunity, into an experience that is going to support how they learn and how they are able to build understanding about the stories. This is actually where we need to be always aware about the fact that story comprehension actually depends on a number of skills, on a number of strategies that we can actually use in the classroom to support precisely how children enjoy and have that ability, that special ability to make meaning out of a story. And particularly when we are helping them to begin and to continue on discovering what are some of the realities that surround them, and many other realities that surround them as well. I think Dr. Henry was going to also share some more about the need and the role of story comprehension.
Yeah, and that's where their higher thinking comes in, because when we read stories to kids, we should not just ask them basic questions like, who are the characters, what is the setting, because that leads them to go back into the text to find the answer. And that's important, but we also want them to go beyond that, to think about how can I connect with this story or with this character? And that's why it is so important for us to select the right books to read to kids, because when we select books or stories that they can connect with, the more they can relate to it and think about it and have new ideas. So we should think about what stories will we read to kids? How can they make connections with it? Because the connections they make with the story will help them to think at a higher level about what would I do if I were in the position of that particular character, or how would I react? So we need to make sure that we choose the right books. Another thing I want to mention here is that be mindful of the fact that sometimes the books you like are not the books that kids will like or that they'll be interested in. So you need to find out what are the interests of kids in your class. And I had a student once who told me that her 9-year-old wouldn't read. He didn't like reading. And so I asked her, who chooses books for your son? And she said she did. And I said, well, that's your first mistake. Find out what he's interested in and then take him to the library and let him choose what he wants. And a few weeks later, she came back and she said that made such a difference, because what she found out was that her kid liked to read about automobiles and airplanes and ships, and she was reading him totally different stories. And now he goes to the library on his own and he's reading up a storm. So it's important for us to select the right book for the kid at the right age.
Thank you for highlighting that point, Dr. Henry, because the truth is, this is where the connections, this is where the stories that belong and that we made to be very, very young actually take place. When we are thinking about what is special, that will also make this child gain an interest in learning more, or where they may see even themselves reflected as well. This is also what I always like to say, that many times there are so many things that we may be doing in our present life or in the future, and it's all because of what we read in a story. It's also what we actually found that was actually there, said in a very special way that touched you. And this is also what happens when you find children that have such a special delight in wanting to go back and reread once again and over again a story. And there's where you find that opportunity to clearly in your classroom see how the story is connecting, how they were able to gather and to get that special message that a story may have. So yes, stories are important, and that's why we want here to put emphasis on the importance of actually using the best strategies to support and to engage children in understanding and taking away the special messages and meaning that stories actually have. And as we say that, yes, we are here for children, and there are many strategies that help us to actually make it actually much more specific and helpful for children to build knowledge about what they are actually finding and learning about in the story. And comprehension strategies are actually targeted precisely at that, at helping our children and helping the reader to figure out and to remember what actually they learn. It's actually finding ways to actually be able to understand, to take away what actually was the message, all the information, the details that they find in what is being read to them. Of course, with children, it's also learning about what they can derive from the illustrations that we find. Picture books or wordless books, they also actually need for us to provide some very good comprehension strategies, because we know that in a picture, in an illustration, there are wonderful ways to tell a story and great messages that are also shared when we look at those strategies, when we look at those illustrations and special pictures that we may have. So in comprehension strategy, what we have is actually, first of all, for us to be able to understand that a story will become meaningful when we also, first of all, understand what are some of the experiences, the prior experiences that children bring. because a story becomes meaningful the moment you're able to connect with that because of something that you have that you lived before, that you were able to experience by yourself, or that you remember that you heard from someone. So whenever we're choosing a story, always think about the children in your classroom. Who are they? What are some of the things that they bring into the classroom? Think about the funds of knowledge. That mean that we realize that every child brings from their own family, from their own culture, so many wonderful experiences that when we are mindful about them, we can actually use those to help children connect and to select stories that will actually be much easier for children to connect with the story. And at the same time, that also validate their own experiences. It's also where we consider already how we can help children to make predictions as we're reading. And predictions also help to establish those connections. And you're going to see us here repeat again and again, making connection, establishing connection, because that is probably one of the most central pieces whenever we're building comprehension strategies. And of course, questioning. That's one of the best ways for us to find and to learn what children are getting away, what actually they derive from the stories. And we want, of course, to go beyond just asking, who was the character? And where did the story take place? Because there's so many more messages and important information that we know children can gather from the story. And precisely that's where we want to use questions, yes, to gather those essential ones, but also to challenge them, because every child has the capacity to actually reflect and consider a story from many different ways and dimensions. Dr. Henry, anything else that you would like to?
Yeah, and with regard to making connections, even as adults, when you go to the bookstore to find a book, when you look at the title, you wonder, can I make any connections with this story? And even now, I am still reading children's books because I like to share them with my students when I'm teaching the children's literature class. And a couple of days ago, I had a class with them and I was reading a part of a story to them. And I chose that book because I saw the connections that I could make with the book. As a teacher, when you're reading these books, they tend to remind you about kids you had in your class, things you did with your kids as you were reading to them. So the more connections kids can make with the story, the better understanding they're going to have of the story. So be careful when you're choosing. Look at the title, think about the story itself, and ask yourself, can my students make connections? Can they relate to this story? Because the more they can relate to it, the better understanding they're going to have of the story.
The more meaningful they will become.
That's right.
Which is actually central to everything that we're planning whenever we bring a story to be shared in the classroom. And this brings us into actually considering some very important points about comprehension, and probably will help us to understand why we're always highlighting story comprehension. And yes, it is central to anything that we do in language and literacy. And it's particularly important not only when we're reading the story, but it's also important when we're listening. So we need to also consider that yes, we're targeting here the use of children's books, the use of story, but remembering also that comprehension goes beyond just reading. It's also when you're listening. And in those read aloud sessions that we have, experiences that we have in the classroom, that's what they're doing, they're listening. So we have to be mindful about how children are actually processing what they listen to or what is being said to them. Comprehension is also expressing. Is what we're able to express and how we are able to express what we're thinking. And that's where, whenever we talk about comprehension, we're also looking at the opportunity for children to express themselves. That's how we're going to be able to learn about all the many different ways in which a child may actually process, may actually get understandings about a particular event or a particular fact or information that a story is presenting. And it's also where we get to learn more about that child. This is also where what we mentioned before, the funds of knowledge may come to help us. Why this child may be actually taking us into learning about how this experience from the book, from the story, may remind him about another thing or another celebration it could be, or in a practice that actually may be reflective of his own cultural experience. It's also thinking about how to communicate with others, what we actually experience when we're reading. So comprehension is also reminding us about listening, but also about sharing, about communicating with others. Perhaps what is most important is also promoting inquiry. It's actually inviting, I always like to say it's an invitation for children to think about what else. What else would you like to think about? What else would you like to know about? Or what else does this remind you of? And certainly, it's also where we invite their imagination.
And I would add here that when you're choosing a story or reading stories to your kids, be mindful of the kids you have in your class, because they're all from different backgrounds, maybe from different cultures. And so their response to you or response to the reading will be different. So be mindful about that and do not dismiss their response because they're responding from a different culture. So you have to be mindful about the kids you have in front of you and be accepted. Accept them for who they are and accept their responses from because they're responding from their own background, their own culture.
And it's actually whenever we say be welcoming of those comments or those observations that children may have, because that's also where we are fostering and promoting their ability to think and their ability to share and to communicate. So yes, we want to always be welcoming. And I think that Dr. Henry mentioned it, and I want to mention it again, don't be surprised at some of the comments, and I'm sure that we will repeat this again, some of the comments that they may say, or some of the ways in which they may actually interpret it, but interpret what they may see, what they may gather from the story. That's also a wonderful way to see how we're challenging the ability to think. And when we're talking about comprehension skills, we're talking about a variety of different skills. So let's start with some of those. And actually, you probably will see, and this is just like a refresher, you probably will see many of those that you're already targeting and in your planning, like identifying the main idea in the story, which is very important. Yes, we all want our children to be able to find what was the main point that we learned about, that the story was about. Certainly recognizing details, that's important, of course. Those are essential and basic up to understanding. But so is as well drawing conclusions. And please, Dr. Henry, feel free to join us and comment.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and when they draw conclusions, kids will come to different conclusions, because even adults, when you read a story, 2 or 3 of us can read the same book and we come to a different conclusion. So, as we said before, accept what the kids say. Don't say that's not relevant, because it is relevant. Because sometimes when kids respond to you or tell you what they got from the story, sometimes you didn't even think about that. Because even young kids can come up with responses that you didn't even think about. So be accepting and accept what they say, and don't say, oh no, that's not what we're talking about now. But be aware of who these kids are and why they're responding the way they're responding.
And most certainly, again, welcome those comments that may surprise you. And I'm sure that many of you, or probably all of you, have been surprised at one point or the other when you were sharing a story in your classroom. I'm sure that because we have, and we continue to be surprised many times whenever we have opportunities and go and visit and actually share stories with children, because the more welcoming you are, the more we are actually supporting and inviting children to share and to let us know, to actually reveal the kind of thinking that they are actually capable of. And I want to emphasize that because it's also where we learn to value the capacity that children have to process their reality and to process circumstances in ways that perhaps are sometimes way beyond what we may even consider that a child is capable of doing. So it's actually an opportunity to value all of those wonderful abilities that children have. Certainly making inferences, making predictions. And this is something that I'm sure that we all do in the classroom, but so important for children to be able to also have an opportunity to express in terms of what they think that may actually happen. Opportunities to compare and contrast. Those also are very central to what we do in terms of building their ability for comprehension. And giving a child an opportunity to evaluate. Yes, young children are capable of evaluating in a critical way when we open it up, when we create again that environment where their ideas are welcome. And of course, this also takes us into realizing that it's very important to consider and to welcome the use of vocabulary. Don't just limit vocabulary in your classroom. Children are capable of actually using what we may call more higher level type of vocabulary if we provide the context, if we provide the right context. And you will see, which is something that I'm always fascinated about, how they will find a way. That term, that word that they found that was different, that was unusual, they will find a way to use it. And that's how we have an opportunity for providing more context and to encourage them to use whichever may be the term that from the story really called their attention. And of course, yes, go ahead.
And going back to what the keynote speaker said, she mentioned the importance of vocabulary. And way back when, years ago, when they were writing these bezas, they would take out the words that had multisyllable because they felt that those words were too difficult for young kids. Well, we come to find out that that did not help them to read, or that did not help them to understand, because kids, they're like sponges. And when you use words and when they hear things, they might not understand it right away, but later on, it becomes important. And I have an example of my neighbor had a 5-year-old granddaughter who was visiting. And at 8 o'clock, he said, "It's time to go to bed." And she said, "Am I not entitled to stay up late?" Now, for a 5-year-old to use the word entitled, she must have heard it someplace else. But and that's the importance of using words, using vocabulary to these kids, because even though they might not react immediately, later on, they remember those words and they use them in the correct context. So don't be afraid to use vocabulary words, and kids might say, "What does that mean?" Then that's your opportunity to explain what the word means.
Absolutely. We provide the context and they will be able to use it appropriately. And that's how vocabulary also grows, which we know is so important. And that goes along with building their ability for language and literacy development. But one of the points that we want to make sure that we highlight today is precisely the need for building thinking skills that are at a higher level. And yes, whenever they are telling us who is the character, the main character, that's part of thinking skill. They are remembering, and that's important. But we know, and the research has very clearly shown to us that children are capable of processing information at a higher level. And we want to make sure that we build and we support that in our classroom, because thinking skill is what really helps a child to dive further into the message of a story. That's where they really get the most out of a story. So we just don't want them to learn about who was that main character, but we want to know. We want them to actually discover and uncover what are some of the special ways, what is the meaning of the actions of the character, and so on. And this is where on purpose, and when I'm saying on purpose, it's clearly with very targeted planning, we will be able to actually provide experiences and opportunities for children to build what we know is called higher order thinking skill. The acronym is HOT. So we want to make sure that we bring those hot questions into our classroom, because it's nothing else but actually challenging children. And again, we know already from all the findings from brain development that yes, they have a capability, that we need to make sure that we actually provide experience in the classroom to actually further support their development. So what we want is children to be given with opportunities to go beyond just memorizing or remembering, because they can actually do much more. And empowering children means that we are recognizing all of the abilities that they bring into our classroom.
And even with simple stories, after you have read the story, you could say, why do you think this character acted this way? What would you have done in that person if you were in that person's situation? So ask them questions that they can relate to, that they and there's no right or wrong answer. As Rosenblatt said, kids' response is their own personal response. It doesn't have to be your response, so that when they respond, they're responding based on their own personal experience. So there's no wrong or right answer. So give kids a chance to respond to stories in their own way, because that's how they're going to develop the skills later on to respond to even more difficult texts.
And give them a chance to show all of that they are capable of doing. And we know that you're already doing that. So we're here just trying to give you some more suggestions and ideas that will actually make all of those efforts that you make in the classroom every day to be actually more supportive of children's capacity. Whenever we're thinking about higher order thinking skills, we need to think also about what has been, what is probably very familiar to us, about Bloom's taxonomy of thinking skills. And yes, there are ways to actually bring that taxonomy into the classroom. And what you see on the screen is actually that taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy, with terms that reminds us about some of the words that we can use whenever we're asking questions in the classroom. The ones that you see at the very bottom, understand and remember, those are the basic ones. But we want to challenge children. And as you see, yes, we're asking them about remembering when we're asking them to identify or to name or to repeat or to, if you recall, those are at the very basic level. Important, we're not saying that they're not, but we want to go beyond just describing. And we want them to begin and to show us that they had the capacity to apply or to analyze, evaluate, or to create. And we ask them to actually apply when, for example, they actually have an opportunity to dramatize something that they saw in the story. And we know that we already do this, so we're just reinforcing how important that is. Or they are becoming able to, for analysis, when they recognize the differences and the similarities that they found through some of the events that took place in the classroom, in the story. Or when you ask them, what would you do in terms of finding a solution? That's analysis, because they have to have a very good understanding about every single detail and all of the possible solutions. They can create, yes, whenever you ask them to design or to construct, maybe they will have an opportunity to construct something directly related to the story when they go into the block center and they show you how they are actually building that in their mind. So there are ways to actually bring this in ways also that will be developmentally appropriate. So using that ability that children have, we're just challenging. This is what actually is meant whenever we talk about bringing higher order thinking skills in the classroom, is challenging children with experiences that are very much targeted. That means that they are on purpose and very intentionally planned and brought into the classroom.
And two things that I want to say here is that, one, whatever the kinds of questions we ask kids are important, because if we only ask basic questions, that's what they're going to be able to respond to. So we need to give them an opportunity to respond at the higher level. Another thing is, we as teachers are always asking questions. We also need to give kids an opportunity to ask us questions, because that's one of the ways that we know they understand the story, or that also helps them to grow. So the questioning should not just be teacher questions, but we should also allow students to ask their own questions.
Thank you for reminding us about that, Dr. Henry, because in the same way that we want our classrooms to be a classroom where we have an opportunity to engage and involve children in literacy, literacy is also not just having a wonderful materials, reading materials, a print material, but also a classroom where there is always children that are engaged in oral exchanges, in oral interactions, because it is as they express themselves that we can better learn about all of the ways in which they are processing and in which they are also challenging us. And that's the beauty of it. As we hear their questions, as we hear their comments, they are challenging us to actually bring more and different kinds of opportunities for them to be also able to capture some of those, again, topics that are addressed through a story that may have become more meaningful and that they want to actually further explore as well. So thinking, it actually comes in both ways. It's also an opportunity for us to think about how else can I actually challenge a child. And that happens probably from the very beginning that we bring or that we select a story into the classroom. We actually saw that this book is probably one that perhaps because we're starting the school year, some of you may be already talking about ways in which children go to school. I'm not sure how many, and when we were actually talking about this earlier, Dr. Henry and I thought that we were not sure how many of you probably may have read this story. This is the way we go to school. But it's something that indeed is a topic that may be familiar for many children. So just think in terms of right now, when the moment you saw the cover, the title, what are perhaps some of the questions that probably already came to your mind as you saw the cover of that story, which is called "This is the way we go to school."
And Dr. Melendez, I'd love for the participants to put in the chat, what are some questions you could ask about the story? So we'll just take a few seconds and for them to record that in the chat.
Yeah, what are some of the first impressions?
Okay, how did you get to school today? That's a good starting question. Good. And this is one way that you can have a conversation. And I go back to the keynote speaker. She talked about conversation. You can have a conversation with your student because, especially here in South Florida, you have kids from all different cultures, and they all go to school different ways. Some ride their bikes, some take the bus, some go by car, some walk, some might ride a donkey, depending on where they're coming from. So this is one way to get to know your students, to get to learn something about who they are.
And I see some very, very good questions already in the chat. How did you get to school? How did you get to school? Or how did you get to school today? Because it could be as well. Maybe today it was a very different day. Who knows what may happen? But that's where we start, actually providing an opportunity for children to start wondering. To think is also to wonder about something. And that's what we want, to make our classrooms into places where there is always that opportunity to inquire about. What you see now is some possible questions that we may want to use, some questions that will prompt that interest and that intrigue into our classroom, for children to be wondering about, well, what may happen, or why is this, or what is another way? If you were here, what would you do? So there's always a question. There is always a way to actually bring, and actually what I like to say is to turn on that light in a child's mind to start wondering about the experiences that surround it, and of course about the experiences that we may find in the story as well. This also probably is an opportunity for us to talk about the fact that yes, we need planning. We need to be very intentional. We all know that how important it is. So we need to get ready to build thinking skills in the classroom. And it first begins by choosing stories that are interesting for the children that you are working with. So that also comes from the very, very thorough and understanding and knowledge about the children that you're teaching. That's what makes a story selection to be developmentally appropriate and to be also culturally appropriate for the children that you're working with. And something that I'm sure that you already know is we need to read the story. And we probably may need to reread the story again and again before we share the story with children, because a story that you may know already may actually present and signify things different for the children that you're working with. Or simply, and I'm not sure how many of you have actually experienced this, but sometimes you may have read a story many times and then you read it again and you find something different. So don't forget to take that opportunity and don't take it for granted that you know the story. You can always find something new. You can also find something new because of the circumstances that surround us in our communities. We know the many different changes and challenges that happen. That also reflects in terms of what story we're going to bring with our students. And of course, we're working with young children. So think about any artifacts, any props that you can actually bring that will connect with the story and then that can also create some intrigue, some interest, but that is going to help and support their comprehension. Because remember, we cannot never forget we're working with very young children. So we need to ensure that we find ways, concrete ways, to actually bring what sometimes may be very abstract for them to understand in ways that will be more appealing to them. And of course, think ahead about some possible questions and being sensitive to the children's realities and experiences as you're actually thinking about those questions. And nothing wrong if you want to actually write them down and put it in a Post-it note behind the book so that you can get a reminder in terms of some questions that you may want to ask the children.
Someone wrote in the chat, ask open-ended question, which is very important. Don't ask questions that kids can respond yes or no, because that doesn't get them thinking. But ask open-ended questions where everybody has a chance to respond and nobody's wrong, because your response is personal. It's your response, the way you respond to the text. So be sure to ask open-ended questions and be prepared for unusual responses and use those as teachable moments. And a teacher once was reading the Johnny Appleseed story to her class. And she asked them a question. I don't recall what the question was, but one kid held up his hand and he was waving it about, and the teacher called on him and he said, well, you see, my father drives a train. And if Johnny Appleseed's father drove a train, Johnny Appleseed would go further, plant more seeds and grow more apple trees, and more people would have apples. Now, that was a very interesting response. It wasn't the response that the teacher wanted, but then it gave the teacher an opportunity to see what the child was thinking. He was making connections to the story, which is so important because that was his connection. Johnny Appleseed's father drove a train, so Johnny Appleseed could have driven on the train. So be prepared for those unusual responses and use those as teachable moments, because sometimes when kids respond to you, even young kids, sometimes their responses are unusual, but that's something that you never thought of. So use those as teachable moments and do not dismiss them as not important.
Absolutely. And don't be surprised either if a story that you thought was going to be very appealing to them may turn out that it's not, but because that may happen too. But again, whenever we're getting ready to share stories, one of the important thing is to have a purpose too. That's what we call by being intentional, by having a plan, because that also will help you to connect with all of the other objectives that you may have in your curriculum, in the experiences that you have planned with the children, for children. It will also help you to connect with the learning standards and learning expectations that we have. We know that we have expectations for children's learning. So having a purpose will help you to make sure that you're also targeting and also providing opportunities for those to be met. But make also the experience to be playful. I think that that's important because that's also what is going to make that experience to be more important and meaningful for the child as well. And like we said before, yes, plan the questions. Let's not forget that. And that's where we need to also consider the wonderful words that may be the terms that may be in the stories. And like we said earlier, don't discard words that may be a little bit more higher level or sophisticated, but turn that into an opportunity for them to learn about. And remember that we have today more stories to choose from than ever before. And that also is an advantage that we have to satisfy and to meet the children's learning needs, and to also meet as well the social and emotional needs to the stories that we share. We're not just only targeting here language development per se, but we also need to remember that at all times, whenever we target language development, we're also remembering that we're making and creating an opportunity for building and supporting their social and emotional development, and for building that sense of attachment and love for learning and teaching in the classroom. Here are some more suggested question prompts that we wanted to share. And especially that takes us into that higher level. And the open-ended question that one of our participants suggested earlier, yes, higher order thinking questions actually target more open-ended responses. And that's what we want also to find in our classroom. So fostering thinking, just to have an opportunity to see what may be some of the differences of what we are actually mentioning. Yes, we had the basic, but we want to make that jump, that leap, taking that leap into what is considered already higher order. And for example, yes, we want them to know who is the character, but we want also for them to have an opportunity to consider, well, if you were the character, what would you do differently? And that's where we're moving things in a different way, in a higher level. Or we want for them to know what happened in the story, but then we want to go further, and then we want to for them to tell us specifically about some of the events. Why was that not good, or what would you do differently? So that's where we move into a different level, into a level where we're challenging further the ability that children have to actually process the information that they have that they have learned through the story. So one thing that we wanted to also to mention is that always try to look for stories that address children's reality, because that's also going to promote their interest, and to connect them with some of the classroom topics. What you see on the screen is some of those topics that children's books that also address different topics that especially are important for us to also discuss and bring into a good conversation in the classroom. Stories that address some of the children's diverse realities. Stories about, for example, when it comes to food preferences, that may be a good opportunity to jump into addressing diversity issues. Or stories that address that child as the new child that came into the classroom. So always try to address and to bring stories that will connect with some of their own realities. Dr. Henry?
Yeah, and to go back to, if you want to go back to that previous slide, tomatoes in my lunch bag. That's a good opportunity to talk to kids about what are some of the things you like to eat, and how is that different for different kids in your classroom. You even might create a graph of who likes tomatoes, who likes peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or tuna fish, or whatever. But that, then you're creating a conversation with kids, and you're learning more about them. And there's another book which they can compare this to, is the Sandwich Swap, where there were two kids, one American and one Middle Eastern. And of course, the American had, for her lunch, she had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And the other kids say, oh, that's yucky. And the American kids say, oh, your sandwich is yucky too. I don't like it. But then when it comes right down to it, they each liked each other's lunch. So because we have such diversity in especially here in South Florida, these are books that we can read and create conversations about, what do you like to eat? What do you like to eat for lunch? What do you like to eat for dinner? And because we want to show that even though you're different, we are all the same. And we like different things, but we're still the same.
They help us to build and to celebrate diversity.
That's right.
I just wanted to mention that some of you may have read the Strictly No Elephant. That's a wonderful story to address not only diversity, but also the need to make sure that for those moments where children are not accepting one to be in their part of their play group, that's a very good story to actually share and to have a good conversation in the classroom. But I know that time is flying by, but we wanted also to look at some opportunities for building thinking skill, and especially whenever we look at any books that we may have used many other times, like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, which we know is probably one of those books that you may have shared many times with children. And just type any questions in the chat box that may actually be a good hot question by order that you would have, just one that you would ask children about the story of The Very Hungry Caterpillar. So thinking again in terms of any story can actually be turned into a very good opportunity to challenge children to think at that very high level that they have the capacity to actually do, and that we want to make sure that we support in the classroom as well.
Okay, I see one question says, what is your favorite food? That's a good question.
Absolutely, that's a very good beginning question to discuss. The Very Hungry Caterpillar is a very good way to actually begin talking about all the different events related to climate change. So very good way to jump into the classroom, especially with what is happening with butterflies. So connect things with some of the events that are happening and that children may have actually become aware because of what they see in the news, or even that they have heard from adults' conversation. And this is another story that we thought, let's share this one too. They may actually have shared this story many times, but any stories any questions that may actually come to mind when you look at this story, Chrysanthemum. And we're hoping that some of you have read the story before. If not, we do invite you to take an opportunity to actually read and share with children about Chrysanthemum.
And some of the questions that you could, of course, I know that, and we all do this whenever we're going to read a new story, we said, what do you think this story is going to be about? Talk about the picture. And in the case of Chrysanthemum, you could ask, who do you think is the character in this story? And it's right there, even though the picture is there, the name is there. Do you know anything about this character? Or what would you do if you were in this character's position? Or what are some things that how do you think Chrysanthemum is feeling in this picture? And get kids to think about it. Do you think this story is true or not? Why do you think it's true, or why do you think it's not true? So what you're trying to do is to get kids to think at a higher level, not just to think about the facts in the story, but to go beyond the story, because that's one way to get them to give quality feedback to your questions.
Right.
Dr. Henry and Dr. Melendez, this is Anna Sejak. This is such a wonderful session, but we are over time now.
Wow.
And we want to give people a little break. So if you could just finish up, because we want to give people a break. The next session starts at 11:05.
Okay.
Thank you, Bo. Yes. No, you
we're
finish
actually
up.
our very last one. This is
Okay.
And one of the things that we always like to do is to kind of bring things to round it up, to be rounded up. And we always like to say, what would you take away for Monday when you go back to be with your children? And some of the things that we thought is important for us to remember, and we're hoping this you will take with you, is that literacy development is basic, it's essential, but especially not just for school, but also for the child's individual success. And of course, central to this is also how they build their ability for comprehending, for understanding, and making meaning from the experiences, the language and literacy experiences in your classroom. And the other thing is that all children are capable of thinking at a higher level, and questioning is one of the ways that you're going to be able to promote that ability to think. But planning is very necessary and very critical to build that capacity to think at a much, much higher level. And of course, we would love to continue our conversation at some other point. And certainly we welcome your comments, and you can certainly reach us, and we would love, again, to hear more about many more ways to actually engage children in what they are capable already of doing, of thinking at that very high level. So thank you, mil gracias, and have a wonderful rest of this conference. Thank you for the invitation to be here.